Hello and welcome back to the Tik-A Tee Method for the second video in this two-part video series on compound time signatures and 6/8. Back in week 21, I talked about what a compound time signature is. So if you haven't checked out that video, it's really important that you watch that one first before proceeding here. Because for today, for week 22, I'm going to be introducing a lot more complex rhythms that you may see in your music and in compound time signatures, specifically around 6/8. So we're going to talk about those complex rhythms. We're going to do a couple of exercises together. I hope you'll stick around for the whole video because we're going to get started right now. Okay, so here we are on the first page of week 21 and 22. In week 21's video, I went over this page in great detail, talking about the difference between a simple time signature and a compound time signature. That's why it's so important that you go watch that video first before proceeding here, because for today's video, we're going to be talking about this page right here. This is a page that has a lot of rhythms that you may see in 6/8 in this compound time signature. There's some common ones, there's some ones that incorporate 16th notes, there's some that incorporate syncopation, there's some that have 16th rests, a lot of fun rhythms here. Now this page, caveat, does not include every possible rhythm that you can have in 6/8. It doesn't, for example, include borrowed divisions, which I'll talk about later in the book. But we're going to go over this page a little bit. We'll talk about these complex rhythms before we do some exercises. The first thing I want to bring to your attention is how nicely the Tik-A Tee Method verbiage translates to compound time signatures. There's nothing tricky here and it's super logical. Quarter notes and longer are ta, eighth notes are ti, 16th notes are ticka-ticka. There's one exception to the rule when you have 16th note syncopation, but just like I talked about way back in week 12, I want to make sure that we, number one, can pronounce it without a tongue twister, and number two, remind ourselves that we have 16th note syncopation. So we'll talk about that in a moment. What I'd like to do is just go through every single rhythm on this page, and you'll notice that the Tik-A Tee verbiage is included. So I'm going to snap my fingers to a pulse, giving us that dotted quarter, and I'm going to go literally through this entire page and just do every rhythm for you. And then I'll talk about a couple of them afterwards. All right, so what I'm going to do is give myself a pitch. I'm going to sing all of these rhythms on a G3, so we're always bringing musical and melodic relevance to rhythms. And I'm just going to snap my fingers, and the snapping will represent a dotted quarter note. In 6/8, there are 2 beats in the measure. The dotted quarter note gets the beat, and each one of these dotted quarter notes can be subdivided into 3 equal parts, 3 eighth notes, like this. T, 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 T. And so forth and so on, okay? So I'm going to start in the upper left-hand corner under common, move over to the 16th note column, then move over to the syncopation column, and then move to the bottom of the page so you can follow along with me. All right, here's my pitch. That's my G3, and I'll give myself a 2-measure count off. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, and ta, 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 ti, 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 ta, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ta, ti, 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 ti. T, ticka, 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 T, T, ticka, T, 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 ticka, T, T, ticka, T, 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 ticka, T, T, ticka, 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 T, ticka, ticka, T, T, ticka, ticka, T, ticka, ticka, T, a T, T, a T, 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 a T, T, a ta, T, ta, 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 T, ta, ta, T, 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 ticka, a ticka, a ticka, a ticka, a ticka, ticka, T, T, T. A ticka 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 ta, a ticka ticka ti ti ti, ticka ticka tick ta, ticka a ticka ticka tick. All right, I think that was all of them. I tried to sneak in some quick breaths there because obviously there are no rests. Well, there's very few rests anyway, so I had to sneak in some breaths, but that should give you a really good idea of all of the rhythms on this page. So let's talk about a couple specific ones right now before we go to that first exercise. So starting off in that far left column, the one that says common, this one could have also been labeled simple, because the rhythms in this column are the most common / simple rhythms that you'll find in 6/8. These rhythms don't include, for example, 16th notes. They don't include any crazy syncopation. They don't include any 16th rests. They don't include any borrowed division, which we haven't even talked about yet. These are the most common simple rhythms. So you heard me say them. You see the Tik-A Tee verbiage there. You can see how they're broken down into 2 dotted quarter notes and 3 eighth notes per pulse. It's pretty straightforward. So I'm not going to go over any specific rhythms in the common / simple column. Okay, let's talk about that middle column, the one with the 16th notes. Now, this one is really fun because this helps emphasize the groove in 6/8. Back in week 21's video, I talked a lot about the groove of compound time signatures, specifically 6/8. Well, when you break down the subdivisions in any time signature further and further, the more you can really feel the groove of that given time signature. Let me show you what I mean. Let's just say I have a duple time signature. You don't know if it's simple or compound. Ta, 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 ta. I'm feeling that. Let's do the metric accents. Ta, 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 ta. Great. But there's no groove yet because we don't know what the subdivisions are. So let's go compound. T, 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 T. Now we're beginning to feel the groove of 6/8. What if I break it down further, like the second column does, into 16th note subdivisions? Here's what it sounds like. And ticka 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 ticka. Now we're really starting to understand and conceptualize how that dotted quarter note is broken down into 3 eighth notes. Those 3 eighth notes are broken down into 6 16th notes per pulse. You can really start to feel that 6/8 groove here. So some of the rhythms in this column are really, really fun. Let's talk about a couple right now. The first 6 rhythms listed under the 16th note column are very, very straightforward, and all they're doing is incorporating 16th notes and 8th notes. So you might have within one beat, within one dotted quarter note, you might have 2 16th notes and then 2 eighth notes. You might have 4 16th note and then an eighth note. Either way, they all add up to 6 16th notes or 3 eighth notes. You heard me say these rhythms when I went through it. Again, they're pretty straightforward. I want to talk about the last 2 in this column because these ones are really, really fun. The one with the dotted eighth note and the 16th note. It's either placed at the beginning of the pulse or towards the end of the pulse. So let's talk about this one right here with the dotted eighth note first. We know that a dotted eighth note is a total of 3 16th notes. All right, so I'm counting 16th notes here in each beat. Then we have 1 16th note here. Then the last eighth note in that beat is 2 16th notes. 3 plus 1 plus 2 is 6 16th notes. Now, what I love about this is how nicely the Tik-A Tee method verbiage translates to this rhythm. T-A Tee, T-A Tee. And I think when I did this, when I went through the entire thing, I actually made that first dotted eighth note staccato. That was just because I had to breathe. I think I did T-A Tee, T-A Tee, which is still the right rhythm, but it's not supposed to be staccato. It's supposed to sound like this. T-A Tee, T-A Tee. So that's a really, really fun rhythm that will be seen in 6/8 pretty often. I could have put that in the common column, but it's not necessarily simple, so I put it under the 16th note column. Now let's look at this second one here, the last one in the 16th note column. This one just takes the dotted eighth note and puts it at the end of the beat. So we have an eighth note first, which gets 2 16th notes. Then we have a dotted eighth note that gets 3 16th notes, and then our final 16th note again, 2 plus 3 plus 1 equals 6 16th notes. So the math adds up nicely. Our invisible bar line would go right here. This rhythm sounds like this. T-T-A T-T-A. Really, really cool. And this one is a little less common than that second to last rhythm, but you will see it. The whole idea of the dotted eighth note to 16th note to eighth note rhythm in 6/8 is super common, and it gives that 6/8 groove just a little bit more of what I call a lilt. I like to use that word when I'm referring to rhythms in 6/8 because there is a certain lilt to 6/8. That's my opinion. Now let's look at the third column, the one that says syncopation. What's happening in this column is we have 3 rhythms that can each be written 2 different ways. So let's just take one at a time. The first rhythm in this column is really fun because it creates eighth note syncopation in a compound time signature, 6/8 in this case, and a little glimpse into the future. This rhythm right here is actually the rhythm that simple time signatures like 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, and so on borrow from to create quarter note triplets. So a little glimpse into the future there. We'll talk more about that when we get into borrowed divisions. Okay, let's talk about this rhythm. Let's take the first way that you can write this rhythm by using a tie and observing that invisible bar line. The invisible bar line would go right here, and let me show you why. Right here in beat 1, we've got a quarter note to an eighth note. That's 3 eighth notes. We know that rhythm. Ta, ti, ta, ti, ta, ti, ta, ti. All right. In beat 2, we've got the eighth note, so the inverse of that rhythm going to the quarter note. Again, still adds up to 3 eighth notes. Ti-ta, 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 ti-ta. But if I erase all of this real quick here and just put the beats above, I would put a 1 here. I would put a 2 here and parenthesize it because we're not going to re-articulate that eighth note. And then this quarter note rather would come in right after the beat, that second eighth note on beat 2. So it sounds like this. Ta, ti, ta, ta, ti, ta. All right, that's the rhythm here. Now, can we write this another way? Absolutely. The only problem with writing it the second way, number one, it can confuse beginning students just a little bit. So I prefer that top way. It makes more sense. It observes the invisible bar line, and we can break down and conceptualize each of the beats, which is really important for deciphering rhythm. However, it can be written like this. We're just breaking that invisible bar line, which would go right here, and we have all tas. Ta, 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 ta. So the question is, would you see this rhythm written as number 2 in this case? Yes, you would, but not as often. And again, my preference would be number 1. That's the way that this rhythm actually should be written so that the musicians reading the music can easily see beat 1 and beat 2. It's really important to be able to decipher from those two beats and to observe that invisible bar line. Our brains want to compartmentalize, so the use of the tie here makes the most sense for this rhythm. And the second syncopated rhythm in this column should also be written like number 1 and not like number 2. Although both of these do observe the invisible bar line, here it is in the first one, here it is in the second one. The second one is just demonstrating how this rhythm can be created using ties. And you would just have all T's. T, 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 T. T, 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 T. But because the rhythms in the first one, that top example, use rhythms from the common column, that's the way it should be written. And it would sound like this. T, ta, ta, T. T, ta, ta, T. So that's pretty straightforward, but it does create syncopation at the beginning of the measure and at the end of the measure. And the third rhythm in the syncopation column is probably one of my most favorite rhythms to perform in 6/8 because it creates 16th note syncopation. But let's pause for a moment and talk about how the Tik-A Tee verbiage translates to this rhythm. We have to think back to week 12 when I first introduced 16th note syncopation. There were 2 criteria that had to be filled. Number 1, the Tik-A Tee verbiage cannot be a tongue twister. It has to be easy to say, even at a fast tempo. And criteria number 2, we want to be reminded that we have 16th note syncopation and not 8th note syncopation. So let's fast forward to today's rhythm. We have a 16th note, then 2 eighth notes, then a 16th note. It doesn't make sense to say tick, tee, tee, ah. Number 1, difficult to say. It would be a tongue twister, even at a slow tempo. And number 2, we want to be reminded that it's 16th note syncopation, and if we have 2 T's in there, that could be confusing because are we implying 8th note syncopation? We want to remember that it's 16th note syncopation. So the verbiage for this rhythm will be tick, ah, 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 which is really, really fun. Now, how did I come up with that? Well, if you look at the rhythm here in number 2, I'm going to label this number 2, you can see where the ties are. Now, this rhythm would never be written like number 2. The reason that I wrote it like this was to exactly show this purpose, to show you where I came up with this verbiage. Tick, ah, ah, ah. And you can see right here, tick, ah, ah, ah. Tick, ah, ah, ah. That's where I came up with this verbiage. It's easy to say at a fast tempo, and it reminds us that it's 16th note syncopation. And let me tell you, it's fun to say. Here's what it sounds like. So if I have ta, ta, ti, 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 ticka, 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 here's what 16th note syncopation sounds like. Ticka, ticka, I'll do it again. Ticka, ticka, That's a really, really fun rhythm to say and perform on your instrument as well. So that's the third syncopated rhythm, and again, one of my most favorite rhythms to perform in 6/8. And at the bottom of the page, these are just examples that incorporate 16th rests. I'm not going to go over these rhythms. You heard me say it earlier in the video. You can pause the video if you want to right now and look at how each beat is broken down into these different rhythms. But these are rhythms that do happen in 6/8 in compound time signatures, so it is worth your while to pause for a moment and check them out. But we are now going to go to that first exercise and put some of this to practice. And today's first exercise is 22C. We're going to efficiently analyze this by putting in where all the beats land, as well as the invisible bar lines, and then we're going to throw a metronome on, give ourselves a pitch, and you're going to perform it with me. Here we go. Beat 1 of measure 1. We have 4 16th notes going to an 8th note. In 6/8, it sounds like this. Tik-A Tee. Tik-A Tee. All right, then we have the invisible bar line, which in 6/8 divides our measure equally in half. Then we have that same rhythm on beat 2. Measure 2, we've got a dotted quarter note, we have an invisible bar line here, and then 3/8 notes. Both of these rhythms occur in the common column from the previous page. And then in measure 3 on beat 1, we have that Tik-A Tee rhythm again from measure 1, invisible bar line. Beat 2, we have 2 16th notes and then 2 8th notes. Tik-A Tee, Tik-A Tee. That's what that rhythm sounds like in 6/8. And then in the fourth measure, we have a quarter note, not a dotted quarter note, just a quarter note that goes to an 8th rest. So we'll cut that sound of that quarter note off on that 8th rest. Our invisible bar line will go right here before the dotted quarter rest, and that gives us time to look ahead to the next measure. And in measure 5, we've got a fun rhythm here on beat 1, Tik-A Tee. Then we have the invisible bar line, and then we move those 16th notes to the end of our beat. So we have beat 2 happening here, Tik-A Tee. So some fun rhythms in measure 5. Going on to measure 6, we have the rhythm from measure 1 happening here on beat 1, the invisible bar line, but then we invert that. We have the 8th note coming first, and then the 4 16th notes on beat 2. Tik-A Tee, which is really, really fun in that measure. Measure 7, we have beat 1 with these 3/8 notes. The invisible bar line goes right here. Beat 2 is this quarter rest, and then the third 8th note of beat 2 is going to be this 8th note right here, which will just be T. It'll be like a pickup into that last measure, an anacrusis, if you will. Fancy word for pickup. In the last measure, we have the rhythm from measure 1, Tik-A Tee happening again, invisible bar line, and then beat 2, we end on a dotted quarter note, and of course I would tell my students to write -1 because we do want to hold that full value. So the first line is a little more complex than anything we did in week 21, but the second line is quite a bit more complex. So let's put a metronome on, let's get a pitch, let's see what this exercise actually sounds like. I'm using the same metronome from imusic-school.com. So again, thank you to the folks at that website for offering up a free online simple metronome. You'll notice that it's at 60. That means 60 beats per minute. Or in our case, the dotted quarter note equals 60. And that's what you would see in your music notation. Dotted quarter note equals 60. So each one of these pulses is going to represent a dotted quarter note. I'll be singing this on a G3. You're welcome to join me on that note, an octave lower, an octave higher, or a different note altogether, but I do hope you'll vocalize exercise 22C with me. Okay, let's get the metronome started. There we go. We're at 60 beats per minute. Here's the G3. This is what I'll be singing the exercise on, and I'm going to give us a 2-measure count-off. 1, 2, ready, and Tik-A Tee, Tik-A Tee, ta, Tee, Tik-A Tee, Tik-A Tee, ta. Tik-A Tee, Tik-A Tee, Tik-A Tee, Tik-A Tee, ta. All right, let's stop that metronome. Okay, that the pickup into that last measure, that anacrusis, that third 8th note on the second beat in measure 7, that's a little bit tricky. That's just a pickup into that last measure, and you heard how I held that last note out full value. Now, how did we do? Did we make any mistakes? Did we do it 100% accurately? This is where we go to my website and we find the MP3 quote-unquote answer for exercise 22C and check our accuracy. Let's go do that right now. Okay, here we are at my website where you can find all 363 of the MP3s that accompany my book. So let's review our options here. Option number 1, you can just listen to the MP3 and check for your accuracy that way. Option number 2, you can vocalize along with the MP3. Or option number 3, especially if your instrument isn't primarily the voice, break out your instrument and perform along with the MP3 for exercise 22C. Okay, without further ado, make your decision. Option 1, option 2, or option 3, because I'm pressing play on exercise 22C right now. One, two, ready, and Tik-A Tee, Tik-A Tee, ta, tee, 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 Tik-A Tee, Tik-A Tee, ta. Tik-A Tee, tee, Tik-A Tee, Tik-A Tee, tee, Tik-A Tee, ta. All right, there it is, exercise 22C. And you can hear how I have the primary beats, those dotted quarter notes on beat 1 and 2. Those are emphasized in the metronome that I created in Logic. But then I also included the subdivision, so you can hear a little bit of the eighth note, all 6 of those eighth notes happening in the measure. That's just to help us better understand 6/8 and the subdivision of 3 for every single one of those pulses. Okay. If you did not yet choose option 3, and that is performing exercise 22C on your instrument, you need to do that before moving on to the next rhythmic exercise or concept. And on to the next exercise, 22G. Now I chose this one because it has that dotted 8th note to 16th note to 8th note rhythm in 6/8. This is the one that's really common. You'll see this a lot in 6/8. Even though I didn't put it in the common column on the previous page, it is a common rhythm, but it does create a little bit of 16th note syncopation with that lilt feel. I really feel that this is the rhythm that gives 6/8 that lilting feel as we go through. T-A-Tee, 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 T-A-Tee. Hopefully you can understand what I mean by that. So we're going to analyze exercise 22G. We're going to put the beats in, the invisible bar lines. We'll talk about the rhythms, and then we'll perform it just like the last exercise. Here we go. Measure 1, beat 1. We've got a dotted quarter note here on beat 1, followed by an invisible bar line here, and then beat 2, a nice simple rhythm, quarter note to that 8th note. Measure 2, 3 8th notes on beat 1, invisible bar line. Beat 2 is this quarter note going to the 8th note. Then in the third measure on the first beat, we have our lilting rhythm. T-A-Tee. T-A-Tee, that dotted 8th note to 16th note to 8th note, which takes up all of beat 1. Invisible bar line is going to happen right here. Beat 2 will be this dotted quarter note, and in measure 4, another simple measure. Beat 1 is here with those 3 8th notes subdividing that dotted quarter note equally, invisible bar line, ending on a dotted quarter note, giving us that opportunity to be looking ahead at the first measure of the second line, measure 5. Where we have 3 8th notes on beat 1, an invisible bar line, and then our cool lilting rhythm, T-A-Tee, happening on beat 2 of measure 5. Going on to measure 6, T-T-T, invisible bar line, and then ta, dotted quarter note on beat 2. Nice simple measure. Measure 7, we have the quarter note going to the 8th note rhythm, then an invisible bar line, then we invert that, an 8th note going to a quarter note here on beat 2. Ta, ti, ta. That's what measure 7 will sound like. And then we close off this exercise with a nice lilting rhythm here on beat 1 of measure 8, invisible bar line, and then a dotted quarter note here on beat 2, -1, holding that dotted quarter note out full value. Okay, we've efficiently analyzed exercise 22G. Now it's time to get a metronome, find a pitch, and perform it. Let's go. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is erase this ink so we can see the exercise a little more clearly. Let's get our metronome started. I'm staying at 60 beats per minute, or the dotted quarter note equals 60. Really important. Here's my G3. That's what I'll be singing the exercise on, and I'm going to give us a 2-measure count off. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, and ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, ti, a ti, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, 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 a ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, a ti, ta. All right, let's stop that metronome. All right, that really cool lilting rhythm is in there, really giving 6/8 that groove and that lilt. Now, we need to know if we did it correctly. You know what we need to do. We need to go find the MP3 for exercise 22G. Let's go do that together right now. Alrighty, here we are back at my website. We, of course, are looking at exercise 22G, and you know what your 3 options are. So make a decision now, because without further ado, I'm pressing play. One, two, ready, and ta ta ti 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 ta ti ti a ti ta ti 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 ta ti 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 a ti 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 ta ta ti ti ta ti a ti ta. And there you have it, exercise 22G. So hopefully you were accurate in performing this one, and hopefully you've chosen the third option, which is to play this exercise on your instrument, because you need to do that before you move on. And that concludes week 22's video. And just like I said at the end of week 21's video, this just touches the surface of compound time signatures, specifically 6/8, our compound duple time signature for these 2 weeks. There are so many more rhythms and practice exercises that you should be doing before moving on to week 23, when I introduce more compound time signatures. That's why it's so important that you go out and you get my book, practice all the exercises for week 21 and for week 22, so you're ready to go for week 23. That's going to be a fun video. I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you join me. In the meantime, please help out the channel. Hit that like and subscribe button and that notification bell so you get the latest video. And if you have a comment or a question, please leave it in the comment section below. I will reply to any and all comments. So until we get to week 23, go out and practice your compound duple rhythms, because I will see you then and we'll get to work.